The Second World War provides aviation history with many great fighter partnerships. Aircraft that formed the mainstays of their nation's air forces together and complemented one another. The P-51 and the P-47, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, the Bf-109 and the Fw-190. Indeed, they are almost like cliches, often eclipsing other perfectly successful fighters and their contributions to the respective war efforts. But of the previous cited examples, the last, between the Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf, was often less about complementing each other and more about bitter rivalry. Considering the standard policy in Nazi Germany of engendering competition between factions, often to a disruptive degree, this probably shouldn't be too surprising. And in fact, the rivalry between Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt dates back to well before the outbreak of war, when both companies were bidding in 1934 for the contract to supply the newly established Luftwaffe with a thoroughly modern fighter aircraft. Messerschmitt's entry was the Bf-109, which would go on to be the most produced fighter in history. Focke-Wulf, with a design team led by the legendary Kurt Tank, entered this, the Focke-Wulf Fw-159. Okay, let's be honest about this, the Luftwaffe definitely chose correctly. The Fw-159 was a parasol single-winged aircraft that, in contrast to the rival Messerschmitt, Heinkel and Arado designs, fitted its wings above the fuselage, supported with struts. A design choice that certainly makes the aircraft a rather odd one when compared to how fighter design developed over the next few years. But, in fact, the decision wasn't completely without merit. This was, after all, 1934, and new biplane fighters were still being fielded by many nations, which makes the Fw-159 far from being anachronistic, and in reality a good deal more advanced than many others in the field. Plus, Focke-Wulf based the design on their existing Fw-56 advanced fighter trainer, which was being assessed by the Luftwaffe at the time and would ultimately be selected. So maybe Focke-Wulf's apparently odd design choices make some sense, as it would be much simpler for new pilots to transition to a fighter that they had a sense of familiarity with from their training. And the Fw-159 was a much more advanced aircraft than the Fw-56. In contrast to its predecessor, it had a fully retractable undercarriage, again an advanced concept that many contemporary fighters did not have. The main undercarriage is arguably the most interesting thing about the Fw-159, as it was double jointed and compressed tightly when retracting, allowing the whole leg to fold into an aperture essentially the size of the wheel. With a snug wheel flap that closed up the fuselage, this led to an extremely streamlined design. Construction was also advanced, with the aircraft being built entirely of metal, having a semi-monocoque construction and skinned in aluminium alloy. Armament was twin MG-17 7.92mm machine guns, while provision was also made for fitting an MGFF 20mm cannon in a motor cannon arrangement, with the gun nestled within the inverted V12 engine and firing through the propeller hub. Power plant in the first prototype, the Fw-159V1, was a Junkers Umo 210A that produced 610 horsepower, and it was with this that the aircraft first took to the skies in the summer of 1935. And here that interesting undercarriage got really interesting. Unfortunately, the system had undergone extensive trials in static ground testing prior to the flight and appeared to function fine, but on this first flight it developed a problem. The test flight proceeded well until it came to lowering the gear, which refused to fully extend. The pilot flew around trying various things, along with getting helpful suggestions from the observers on the ground, who signalled him with written messages, but nothing seemed to work, and with his fuel exhausted, he was forced to make an emergency landing. The V1's landing gear promptly collapsed, spinning the aircraft over several times, writing off the airframe, but remarkably not hurting the pilot. Focke-Wulf set about preparing a second aircraft, the V2, which featured a much hardier undercarriage though retaining the same power plant. This began flight testing, and the aircraft proved to have good flying characteristics, though was notably inferior to the rival Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Heinkel He-112. Seeking to improve performance, Focke-Wulf built a third prototype, the V3, which was fitted with a more powerful UMO 210G engine that was rated at 730 horsepower. And with this, the aircraft recorded its maximum speed of 252 miles per hour in mid-1937. This actually met the original specification that had been issued, but was substantially slower than the rival designs, and all in all, the FW159 was considered decidedly inferior to both the Messerschmitt and the Heinkel aircraft. The Bf-109 had already been selected to be the new German fighter in March 1936, but despite this, it was thought prudent to keep testing the FW159 in case of failure in service of either the Messerschmitt or the He-112. After all, these were cutting-edge designs, and hitting unforeseen issues was a distinct possibility. The two FW159s therefore carried on flying until 1938, though they did suffer repeated issues with their undercarriage, with the novel system proving unreliable and prone to collapse despite the amount of work put into it. By this point, the Luftwaffe had got over its reservations with the Bf-109, and in fact were thoroughly enamoured with it, and so the FW159s disappeared from the scene. But the experience was not wasted, and even as the FW159s were heading for the scrapyard, Kurt Tank was already hard at work building a far more formidable fighter, his legendary FW190, and for which he was able to draw on the lessons from both the 159 and the Bf-109, and thus create a truly superlative fighter. But I can't help but imagine what it would have looked like had the FW159 proven a little better, or else its rivals had failed to deliver. Imagine, say, the Battle of Britain, with Spitfires and Hurricanes going toe to toe with this. It certainly seems a rather odd picture, doesn't it?